You think you know who the richest families in history were? The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, names that echo through centuries of financial power. But there was a family that came before them all, a family so wealthy, so powerful, that they bankrolled entire empires, toppled kings, and rewrote the rules of European finance. And yet, most people have never heard their name. The Fuggers, a family that turned banking into an art form, debt into a weapon, and information into the most valuable currency of all. This is not ancient history. This is the blueprint for every financial dynasty that followed. And if you understand how they did it, you will never look at money and power the same way again. The story begins in 1438 in Augsburg, a city in southern Germany. Hans Fugger was a weaver, nothing special, just a craftsman working with textiles in a modest town. But Hans had something most people lack: vision. He did not just weave cloth. He understood trade. He understood that money flows where goods flow, and he understood that the real fortune was not in making things, but in moving them. So he started small, trading textiles, building relationships with merchants, expanding his network across Europe. By the time he died, he had laid the foundation for what would become the most powerful financial empire of the Renaissance. But it was his grandson, Jacob Fugger, who turned that foundation into an unstoppable force. Jacob was born in 1459, and from the very beginning, he was different. While other merchants focused on textiles, Jacob saw something bigger. He saw mining, silver, copper, the metals that fueled Europe's economy, the materials that minted coins, forged weapons, and built empires. And he realized something crucial. Whoever controls the metals controls the money. Whoever controls the money controls the kings. So, Jacob made a deal. He lent money to the Habsburgs, the most powerful royal family in Europe. Not small loans, massive loans. Loans so large that the Habsburgs could not function without him. And in return, Jacob did not just ask for interest. He asked for mining rights, exclusive access to silver and copper mines in Tyrol and Hungary. This was genius. Because while other bankers simply lent money and hoped to be repaid, Jacob built a system where repayment was automatic. The metals extracted from the mines flowed directly to him. The Habsburgs got the cash they needed for wars and politics. Jacob got the raw materials that underpinned the entire European economy. But here is where it gets even more brilliant. Jacob did not just mine the metals. He controlled the smelting. He controlled the refining. He controlled the distribution. He built a vertical monopoly. And when European kings needed coins to pay their armies, guess who supplied the silver? When the Catholic Church needed copper for bells and cannons, guess who provided it? Jacob Fugger, the man who owned the backbone of European industry. By 1500, Jacob Fugger was the richest man in the world, not figuratively, literally. His wealth was estimated at 2% of Europe's entire GDP. To put that in perspective, if you took the wealth of the richest person alive today, multiplied it several times over, you still would not come close to Jacob Fugger's fortune. But wealth alone does not make you the most powerful man in Europe. Kings have armies. Popes have the church. What made Jacob truly untouchable was that he understood something most people never learn. Debt is not a burden. Debt is control. If you owe the bank $1,000, that is your problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, that is the bank's problem. If you owe the bank everything, the bank works for you. And Jacob Fugger made sure that the most powerful men in Europe owed him everything. In 1519, the Holy Roman Emperor died. The throne was up for election. This was the most important political position in Europe. Whoever held it controlled vast territories, commanded armies, and dictated policy across the continent. There were two main candidates, Charles of Spain, backed by the Fuggers, and Francis I of France, backed by Italian bankers. The election was not decided by popular vote. It was decided by 7 electors, princes and archbishops who each had a price. And the price was high. Charles needed money, enormous amounts of money. He needed to bribe the electors, pay off rivals, and finance a campaign across multiple countries. So he turned to Jacob Fugger, and Jacob did what he always did. He lent the money, 543,000 florins, an astronomical sum, the equivalent of billions today. Charles won the election. He became Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, king of Spain, and lord of vast territories in the New World. And Jacob Fugger owned him. But here is the twist. Charles did not repay the loan immediately, because he could not. Wars drained his coffers. Politics demanded constant spending. And Jacob knew this. He did not demand immediate repayment. Instead, he demanded something more valuable: influence, access, the ability to shape policy, control trade routes, and dictate financial regulations. The Fuggers did not just lend money to kings, they became the king's advisors, the power behind the throne. And here is where the story gets even darker. Jacob Fugger did not just finance emperors, he financed the Catholic Church. Specifically, he financed the sale of indulgences. If you are not familiar, indulgences were certificates sold by the church that promised to reduce your time in purgatory. Essentially, you could buy your way out of sin. The church needed money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a grand cathedral that would stand as the symbol of Catholic power. But cathedrals are expensive, so the Pope authorized the sale of indulgences across Europe. And guess who financed the operation? Jacob Fugger. Here is how it worked. The church appointed agents to travel across Europe selling indulgences. People paid cash. The agents collected the money and deposited it in Fugger banks. The Fuggers took a cut. Then they transferred the funds to Rome, minus another fee. It was brilliant. The church got its cathedral, the Fuggers got richer, and the common people, they got a piece of paper promising salvation. But one man saw through it: Martin Luther. A monk who looked at the system and said, "This is corruption, this is fraud." And in 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation. The entire structure of European Christianity split in two. Wars erupted, millions died, and at the center of it all was a financial transaction engineered by the Fuggers. Now, you might think this would destroy the Fuggers. That being tied to one of the most controversial schemes in history would ruin their reputation, but it did not. Because Jacob Fugger understood something that modern politicians and bankers still exploit today. If you are too big to fail, the system will protect you. The church needed the Fuggers. The emperors needed the Fuggers. Even Luther's supporters, the Protestant princes, eventually borrowed from the Fuggers. Because money has no loyalty. It flows where power flows, and the Fuggers controlled the flow. But wealth at this scale does not come without enemies. And Jacob Fugger had plenty. Rival bankers tried to undercut him. Kings resented their dependence on him. The common people hated him for his monopolies and his role in the indulgence scandal. There were assassination attempts, legal challenges, political conspiracies. But Jacob survived them all. How? Information. The Fuggers built the most sophisticated intelligence network in Europe. They had agents in every major city, correspondents in every court, spies in every rival's house. They knew what kings were planning before their own advisors did. They knew which wars were coming, which currencies would collapse, which trade routes would open. Information is power, and the Fuggers weaponized it. Every week, Fugger agents sent reports back to Augsburg. Political developments, military movements, economic trends. This was not casual gossip. This was strategic intelligence, and Jacob used it to make decisions that kept him ahead of every rival. When other bankers were blindsided by a war, Jacob had already repositioned his assets. When a currency devalued, Jacob had already converted his holdings. When a king defaulted on a loan, Jacob had already secured collateral that was worth more than the debt. He did not just play the game. He rigged it. Jacob Fugger died in 1525. He was 66 years old. By the time of his death, he had accumulated a fortune so vast that no one individual has ever matched it in relative terms. But here is the thing about dynasties. They are only as strong as the people who inherit them. Jacob had no children. The family business passed to his nephews. And for a while, the Fuggers remained powerful. They continued lending to emperors. They continued controlling trade. They continued accumulating wealth. But cracks were forming. The world was changing. Spain was bringing vast amounts of silver from the New World. The influx of precious metals caused inflation. The value of money began to shift. The Habsburgs, drowning in debt, began defaulting on loans. Not just small loans, massive loans. Loans that the Fuggers could not absorb without consequences. And slowly, the empire that Jacob built began to erode. By the end of the 16th century, the Fuggers were still wealthy. But they were no longer the untouchable financial titans they once were. The world had moved on. So what happened? How does a family go from owning emperors to fading into obscurity? The answer is simple. They became too dependent on a single system. The Habsburgs, the Catholic Church, the European monarchy. When that system began to collapse under the weight of its own debt and corruption, the Fuggers collapsed with it. They did not diversify. They did not adapt. They held on to the old model too long. And the new world, the world of stock markets, joint stock companies, and modern banking, passed them by. But here is the lesson. The Fuggers did not fail because they were not smart. They failed because the system they dominated became obsolete. And this is the pattern throughout history. The Medici, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, they all rose by mastering the financial system of their time. And they all declined when that system evolved beyond them. The question is not whether a system will change. The question is whether you will see it coming. Now, let us talk about what the Fuggers teach us today. Because their story is not ancient history. It is a mirror. Look at how Jacob Fugger operated. He lent money to those in power, not because he was generous, but because debt creates dependency. He controlled resources, not because he wanted to hoard them, but because control over supply is control over price. He built an intelligence network, not because he was paranoid, but because information is the ultimate competitive advantage. Does any of this sound familiar? Today's central banks lend to governments. Governments cannot function without that debt. Corporations control supply chains, from semiconductors to rare earth minerals to energy. Whoever controls the supply controls the economy, and tech companies harvest data, not for fun. But because data is the modern equivalent of Fugger's intelligence network, the more they know about you, the more they can predict, influence, and profit. The difference between Jacob Fugger and today's power brokers is not strategy, it is scale. Fugger controlled a continent. Today's financial empires control the world. Fugger's intelligence network relied on letters and messengers. Today's intelligence network is algorithmic surveillance that tracks every click, every purchase, every word you type. Fugger lent to kings. Today's banks lend to nations. The game has not changed, it has just gotten bigger. So, what does this mean for you? First, understand that debt is a tool of control. If you are in debt, someone else controls your choices, your future, your freedom. The system is designed to keep you borrowing. Student loans, mortgages, credit cards, not because the system wants you to thrive, but because debt is profitable. Second, recognize that monopolies are not accidents. They are engineered. Every major industry today is dominated by a handful of corporations. This is not market efficiency. This is the Fugger model. Control the supply, control the price, control the market. Third, information is power. The Fuggers knew what was happening before anyone else. Today, the elites still operate the same way. They have access to data, research, and intelligence that you do not. If you want to level the playing field, you need to educate yourself. Read financial reports. Understand economic trends. Question the narratives you are fed, because ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is vulnerability. Fourth, systems change. The Fuggers dominated their world for nearly a century. Then the system shifted, and they faded. The same will happen to today's elites. The question is, will you be ready when it does? Because the people who thrive are not the ones who cling to the old system. They are the ones who see the new one coming and position themselves accordingly. History does not repeat itself exactly, but if you do not understand it, it will crush you just the same as it crushed everyone else. The Fuggers were richer than the Rothschilds, more powerful than any banker in history, and yet, most people have never heard of them. Why? Because they did not write the history books. The winners did, and the winners were the ones who adapted when the Fuggers could not. Let us go deeper into one specific example of Fugger power. In 1523, Emperor Charles V needed money for yet another war, this time against France. The costs were staggering. Armies had to be paid, supplies had to be purchased, alliances had to be maintained. Charles turned to Jacob Fugger, again, and Jacob, as always, provided the funds. But here is what makes this transaction fascinating. Jacob did not just hand over the money, he negotiated terms that gave him control over the entire tax revenue of certain Spanish territories. Imagine that. A private banker controlling the tax income of an empire. This was not a loan. This was a transfer of sovereign power, and it was legal because the emperor had no choice. This is the model that modern finance still follows. When a country is drowning in debt, international institutions step in. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They provide loans, but those loans come with conditions. Austerity measures, privatization, policy changes. The country gets the money it needs to survive, but it loses control over its own decisions. This is the Fugger playbook. Debt is not just money owed, debt is leverage, and leverage is power. Now, think about your own life. How much of your income goes to servicing debt? Your mortgage, your car payment, your credit cards? How much freedom do you really have when a significant portion of your earnings is already spoken for before you even receive it? This is not an accident. This is by design. The system wants you in debt. Because debt makes you predictable, controllable, compliant. You cannot take risks when you have bills to pay. You cannot leave a job you hate when you are one paycheck away from missing a payment. You cannot challenge the system when you are part of it. The Fuggers understood this on a grand scale. They did not need to conquer empires. They just needed emperors to owe them money. They did not need to control the church. They just needed the church to depend on their financing. And once that dependency was established, they were untouchable until they were not. Because the system changed. And when the system changes, the old rules no longer apply. So, what is the system today? Fiat currency, central banking, fractional reserve lending, government debt, corporate monopolies, digital surveillance. These are the pillars of modern financial power. And just like in the Fugger era, the people who control these pillars are the ones who shape the world. But systems are not permanent. They evolve, they break, they collapse. And when they do, the people who were on top often find themselves at the bottom. The Fuggers made one fatal mistake. They believed their system was eternal. They believed the Habsburgs would always rule. They believed the Catholic Church would always dominate. They believed silver and copper would always be the foundation of wealth. But Spain discovered the New World. Silver flooded Europe. The church split in two. The old order crumbled. And the Fuggers, who had built their empire on that old order, crumbled with it. Today's elites are making the same mistake. They believe fiat currency will always be accepted. They believe central banks will always control monetary policy. They believe their monopolies will never be challenged. But history teaches us otherwise. Every empire falls. Every currency eventually fails. Every monopoly is eventually broken. The only question is when and whether you will be prepared. So, the next time someone tells you that the system is too big to change, remember the Fuggers. The next time you hear that a family or corporation is too powerful to fall, remember the Fuggers. Because no empire lasts forever. Not Rome. Not the Habsburgs. Not the Fuggers. And not the ones in power today. The only question is whether you will be a victim of the collapse or one of the few who saw it coming and prepared.